Welcome back to part 2 of the How to Change Your Garage Door Spring Like a Pro series.
For those that didn't see the first video, my credentials, I've been doing this for about 10 years. I've moved up through the ranks. I'm currently in manager slash sales, so I know spring change is like the back of my hand at this point. I have learned the best way to do it the correct way, and I'm very familiar with all the ways to do it the wrong way.
I do recommend, if you haven't already, watch the first video. Again, in that video we go over how to measure the spring, how to calculate what spring you need, things to know and consider. This video we're picking up where we left off, assuming that you have the springs on hand ready to install and you're ready to now just install them. So this video will be focused on installing, how to do it the safest way, and the most thorough professional way so that you can have them as long lasting as possible. The tools you're going to need, you are going to need a screwdriver, flathead, and possibly a Phillips head. I do recommend an assortment of wrenches, but at the very least you're going to need a 9/16 and a half inch, a vice grip, a wrench, an assortment of sockets, but most likely what you're going to need the most of is 9/16, a half inch, maybe 7/16. And then this one right here is very important. So this is a 7/16 12 point. So you can see how it's not a perfect hex head or square or anything, it's a 12 point. This allows it to cater to these square set screws. It fits on there just perfect. You are also going to need your set of winding bars. Again, this is one of the most important tools. A lot of people try and make do with something like this. And again, though it fits in the hole, that's a lot of torque on there. This is not made for that. That's actually one of the most common mistakes that result in an injury, is using something not designed for it, holding a lot of tension, and that thing blows up and throws out shrapnel or whatever. You're also going to need an impact drill. You can get by with most of this with just a wrench, but this is going to make it obviously way quicker. Optional stuff you may or may not need. You might need a file or grinder. This is an example of what a waffled shaft would look like. Essentially, these set screws were just tightened down way too tight. You'd be amazed how even professionals, quote unquote, oftentimes still do this. So for example, this thing will not go through the spring like this. It might if you really force it, like you're hammering and stuff, and that's fine to do if you're taking off a spring once it's fully unwound, but I would never recommend hammering a new spring because again, this cone here, this cone here, as well as the other end of the spring also has a cone. They're a very brittle metal, so hitting it with a hammer, even if you make microscopic cracks in it, it's very bad. There's a lot of tension on it. So this is something that, again, you would have to use a grinder, probably file that down at least 2 inches wide. And you're just kind of like brushing over it, just taking, a little bit at a time, probably this side as well, and this side as well, until it goes smoothly. Again, a hand file would work, but it's going to take forever. Alternatively, you might need this instead of this 12 point, mainly because there's a brand out there called Martin. So instead of using these square head set screws, what they'll use is this little hex head set screw. I'm not sure this exact size. It's kind of funny. I've been in the garage door business long enough. I just know that this is the wrench I use on that. I believe it's a 3/16 inch, but I might be wrong. But again, sometimes you'll see where inside there, instead of this big red head, is just a little hex head set screw that you have to tighten.
Jumping right into step one. First, you're going to remove your springs from the box that they came in, if they did come in a box. Inspect them thoroughly, mainly the cones on either end. Make sure that they're not cracked. Make sure that your winding bars look good if they did come with winding bars, and or whatever winding bars you got look good. Step two, and this is very important, you do want to either unplug the motor or remove the J-arm from the door. If your kid or spouse comes home and they don't realize what's going on and they press the button to the motor, you will regret it. Step three will be unwinding the springs. First, you want to make sure your winding bar is in there and you have a good grip. Then with your wrench with the 12 point socket or the hex head adapter for Martin, you will want to undo those set screws. You're going to release tension from those set screws and then you will be holding it on that bar. So expect to be holding anywhere from 20 all the way up to 80 pounds depending on how big and heavy your door is. A door like this was probably holding maybe 30 to 40 pounds. Then one by one, you will just basically unwind the spring. Just make sure every single time you're going into this, you make sure it's all the way in, set correctly, and that you have a good grip. The worst thing that can happen is if you do not have a good grip or if it's not in all the way, it can cause serious injury. Once you are certain the springs have no tension on them, you can undo the spring center plate where they are joined together. This is usually 9/16 bolt and nut.
So here's a trick that a lot of experienced technicians will tell you. When you're up there working on your springs and you're unwinding the drums, before you unwind them, if you mark where they are at, then when you put them back, it's actually a lot easier to line up. Again, this is under the assumption that, you know, the previous installer actually took the time and care to make sure they're perfectly balanced. If they didn't, and you're putting them in the same spot, then I mean, it's still not perfectly balanced. But at the same time, if it's run for, you know, 15 or so years, then it's safe to assume that they at least did somewhat decent. Draw a line from the shaft to the drum, just like that. So when I go to unwind it, you can see that I now have a mark of where to put it. And again, you can see this is the set screws. For future reference, because we'll get back to putting the drum back on, this is about probably 3/4 to 1 full turn on the set screws. And again, that's plenty. You do not need to hammer it in there. I mean, that much is enough that it kind of gets caught a little bit, but it will still slide through there. So again, when you go to put it back on, you got your mark there and right there. So you're gonna line them up. And when you're very close, I mean, you'll actually feel the set screws go into the same holes they once were. I mean, it literally like kind of kicked over into there. So that's just hand tight right now, like not even really tight, just to the point that it hits. But I mean, if I try and twist it or anything, you can feel that it's actually in the same groove. So that's how you make sure that your drums are put in the exact same spot.
When removing the drums, you will want to put the cable somewhere so it doesn't fall down and get tangled. I usually just do a loose half knot around the track. If it does fall down, it's not a big deal. You can pull it back up. You just need to make sure that it's not wrapped around the track brackets or any rollers or anything else. It should be straight up from the bottom of the panel all the way to the drum. Now we are ready to remove and replace the springs. From the center plate, when you undo it, you can slide them both to either side or both to the same side. You will then remove the drum, the first spring and or two-piece spring if it is broken, the middle bearing, and then the next spring. You then will slide them on in reverse. Make sure you pay attention to which side is which. Your left-hand spring usually has a red marking on it. Your right-hand spring actually has a black marking on it. It is confusing because if they are actually marked and or it's written on the spring, it'll say LH and RH, left hand and right hand. But the left hand is actually the direction it turns, so it will actually be on your right hand side. And vice versa for the right hand, it will actually be on the left hand side. General rule of thumb is that if you look at the end cone where the set screws are and the coil, how it's turning on it, the end coil that is closest to you should be pointing up towards the ceiling. If it is pointing down, that is wrong. Note again, this is for standard lift situations. Next step, we are going to reattach the drums. Again, if you marked the drums with a Sharpie, you should be able to find essentially where the holes were initially. Once you have the drum set and fairly tight, set your vice grip against the header to hold it tight. Make sure you always set the left drum first, as when you set the right drum, it'll start to tighten a little bit more. So if you do the right drum first and then the left drum will almost always be a little bit loose. To figure out how many winds need to be on the drum, unless you counted how many you took off from the initial spring, I would measure the height of the door. The general rule of thumb is 1 wind per foot of the door, plus an additional half to full wind on top of that. So for a 7-foot high door, you should be somewhere between 7.5 to 8 full winds. Again, and I can't stress this enough, be careful, make sure every single turn you're putting your winding bar all the way in and that you have a good grip. Don't let anything slip out. Don't put it partial way in where it might break out. This is definitely where we see and hear of people getting injured the most doing spring changes.
So when you tighten this back up, I would recommend that you tighten it about 3/4 turn, maybe like 7/8 of a turn after it hits the metal. So for example, okay, that just hit the metal there. That just hit the metal there. So I'm gonna now turn it 1/4, 1/2, 3/4 turns. We'll do the same here. So this is about 1/4, 1/2, 3/4. I'm going to show you what that does. So you can see how much that dug in. That right there is plenty. A lot of professionals will tell you only to do about 1/4. A lot of them will tell you to do 1 full one. To me, that's a good dig in without actually waffling the shaft very much. You can see it's like very slightly bowed right there. But at the same time, it still goes through just fine. Again, you don't want it waffled like this. That's like 4 or 5 turns or something like that.
When you go to test the door by hand, this is where the real trained professionals feel comes in. You can see I lifted it and it wanted to drop when it was halfway up. This means it did not have enough tension, so I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more tension. If you get the springs correct, it should be balanced in the middle, and even more importantly, it should be pretty consistent all the way up and all the way down. If it's something where it bounces in the middle but it's really heavy at the bottom and wants to fly up at the top, that means that your springs are not strong enough. You need another spring size that's stronger. If it's the opposite, where it wants to drop at the top but wants to fly up at the bottom and is neutral in the middle, that means that your springs are actually too strong and you can't add enough tension, so you need a weaker spring. So again, this falls back to how important it is to calculate the right springs. Just matching what is already on there doesn't necessarily mean it's right. There's a lot of trained professionals, quote unquote, that will give you the wrong spring. They'll give you something close enough because they don't want to spend the extra time to get the right springs on there. You can then reconnect your motor and lube up the door. From there, you can try running the motor as is, but most likely you will need to at least reset forces on your motor. That is a programming feature that tells the motor how hard to push the door down and how hard to pull it up. If they are fine-tuned, they should only be running whatever it takes to run your door plus only 5 pounds. But a lot of technicians will just crank it up to 11 to where it's running closer to 60 or even 100 pounds. This is not only dangerous, but it's also something that if your door ever does get caught, it's going to create a lot of problems. Refer to the motor owner manual on how to change forces. They are different in every motor. In a future video, I'll go over programming forces and limits on motors, at least the most common 2 current motors, which is overhead door / Genie and LiftMaster / Chamberlain / Craftsman. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Leave a like and subscribe, and tune in next time.